Okay, hi and welcome to another conference of the public program of the School of Architecture and Urban Studies, de la Escuela de Arquitectura y Estudios Urbanos at Universidad Torcuato de Itela. Today we'll be having a conference by Albena Yaneva as part of a cycle series called Influential Theories, and this conference is organized together with the Master in History and Culture of Architecture and the City, and it will have a response and an introduction by Julián Varas, the director of the Master. And let me just make a very brief introduction to the cycle. That is a cycle that's been going on for some years now, and Influential Theories organizes conferences and roundtables in which inclinations and tendencies and ideologies and researches and ideas that are capable of directly influencing the current architectural culture are presented, and it seeks to address the broad spectrum of contemporary architectural thought. So activities are programmed with the objective of instigating and setting in motion the current debate, and they are aimed at constructing new reasons and meanings for making architecture. And so the conferences question different forms of relevance in a constantly changing and productive technical and cultural context. So it is in this way that we understand that in its active form, theory acquires the ability to communicate traditionally segregated domains in order to anticipate and induce projects and modes of practice. So I will hand it on to Julián Varas. Julián, if you are there.
Hold on a minute. Hello.
Okay, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to today's inaugural lecture of the academic year 2021 of the Master in History and Culture of Architecture and the City of the School of Architecture and Urban Studies of Itela. My name is Julián Varas and I direct the program. And good afternoon to Albena Yaneva, who is a few hours ahead of us in Manchester and soon will be joining us. For those who are unaware, we have been exchanging emails with Albena since the beginning of last year in order to make her seminar at Itela and this lecture come to fruition. So we are very glad that despite the pandemic, the seminar and now the lecture have taken place. And we are very thankful to Albena for hopping on board. So I'd like to say a few words to introduce Albena Yaneva and about why we are interested in her work. Coming from the field of anthropology and specifically from the anthropology of knowledge practices, Albena Yaneva took the field of architecture by storm around 10 or 15 years ago when she began to lay out a pragmatist framework for architecture based on the tradition of actor network theory. Since then, she has written extensively about contemporary architecture from a perspective that is quite uncommon among theorists. Theoretical discussions in architecture are typically concerned either with the normative and ideological aspects of practice or with what one could call a performative assessment of the built environment, but one in which the focus is narrowly defined around social issues, environmental issues, issues of perception, of practice, or issues of semantics. However, until Albena Yaneva's influence on architecture began to make itself widely felt, there was hardly anyone attempting to knit all of those preoccupations together. We did see a re-emergence of pragmatist thinking in architecture in the early 2000s or maybe even before that. But in hindsight, it seems that what brought those thinkers and practitioners together was more clearly a reaction against the excesses of critical theory rather than a newly formulated set of principles for practice or research. In that context, Albena's work began to craft, if I may borrow her own words, an approach to the theory and criticism of architecture that would become increasingly relevant. In the traditional conception of authorship, the author was regarded as someone whose conceit was to impress a particular type of formal coherence upon matter. In this conception, the politics of the author is limited to what the architectural project is capable of doing as a consequence of its topological organization and formal articulation. In contrast to this, the conception advocated by Albena Yaneva is that architectural authorship should be regarded as a composition of agencies, as the design of a choreography of forces, and as the political mobilization of matter, and that these premises go beyond the project and assert their relevance in relation to the built artifact. It is interesting to note that this conception of authorship has attracted many practitioners, some of which we know very well, and for those who are interested to investigate that further, I would direct them to a book that Albena co-edited with Alejandro Sarapolo titled What is Cosmopolitical Design? But beside the originality of those ideas, it is interesting to also note that, that she has managed to amplify what seemed initially like a theoretical attack on some of the old schools of architectural thinking and turn those ideas into a very diverse set of operational instruments. Not only has she published prolifically over the last 15 years, but she has managed to do so while developing a set of unique research methods and writing style. So for us, Albena, your presence in the program is as much about spreading the theoretical concepts that your work has developed, but also about learning research techniques to deal specifically with contemporary issues in architecture and urbanism. Albena Yaneva is a professor of architectural theory at the University of Manchester in the United Kingdom. She's worked at Princeton School of Architecture and at Parsons, and has occupied the Lise Meitner visiting chair in Lund, Sweden. She's the author of The Making of a Building, 2009, Made by OMA, and Ethnography of Design, 2009, Mapping Controversies in Architecture, Routledge, 2012, 5 Ways to Make Architectural Political, An Introduction to the Politics of Design Practice, 2017, and most recently, Crafting History, Archiving, and the Quest for Architectural Legacy, published last year by Cornell University Press. Her work has been translated into German, Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Thai, Polish, Turkish, and Japanese. And Albena Yaneva has received the RIBA President's Award for Outstanding Research. So without anything further, I would like to welcome you, Albena, and yeah, you can take over.
Thank you very much, Julian, for this introduction. I will share the screen. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to share this new project with you. And I was very impressed by the quality of your master program while working with your students, Julian, this last term. The topic for today's lecture is the craft of archiving, and it's based on this recent book that Julian mentioned, titled Crafting History. This study on archiving is motivated by a number of recent developments in the social sciences, the arts, in philosophy and anthropology, dating back to the 90s. The archival fever in philosophy became a popular term with the writings of Derrida and also the writings of Paul Ricoeur in the 90s. The archival turn in anthropology was happening at the same time in the 90s, so the field of philosophy somehow has infected anthropology, but also visual arts with the emergence of archival arts. And we also witnessed witnessed an empirical turn in archival science at the same time. So all these developments in the 90s, in a way, open up new avenues for exploring architectural archives, and in particular, archiving as a process. The computer entered architectural practice also at the same time. So we're talking about end of 80s, the beginning of the 90s. And architectural practice was radically transformed by the computer. The awareness that the paper drawing can have an archival value also gained a momentum at that time. Archives piled up in big firms and these firms began appointing archivists, record managers, PR managers. So they became much more aware of the importance of archives and their own legacy. So these are the first traces of archival fever in the field of practice, we might say. New versions of computer-aided design, form-generating software, parametric and post-parametric applications came to replace the tradition of sketching. And that technological moment, when digital materials moved into the dominant position, made architects become more aware of the importance of organizing archives and taking care of their legacy. It is very hard to imagine the act of design without thinking of the archival gesture. The amassing of archives happens as an underlying dimension of design practice, underpinning its existence. It is inherent to the creative process. The more architects create, the messier their offices get, and thus the greater the need for organizing the archiving and archiving the material becomes. Some practices keep everything, and I have witnessed this firsthand during my ethnography of the Office of Metropolitan Architecture in Rotterdam. They keep everything, and I have followed form models being part of archives, becoming part of huge boxes like the one you see on this slide. They travel to storage, then stay there for a while and come back to the practice as soon as a project is again active in the firm. So I witnessed all this this process also in other firms while working alongside architects in other practices. Architectural practice naturally results in an extraordinary accumulation, we might say, of visuals and archival media that demand sorting, cataloging and organizing at a certain moment in time in order to avoid the amorphous accumulation of materials in the office. Practicing architects very often trace a distinction between collection and conscious archive. So, for instance, we see here on this slide Eisenman, who is a great collector. He's in his practice discussing collections and archiving in an interview. So he keeps all sorts of letters and documents, different materials, scraps of paper, and has huge collections of books, magazines, letters, drawings of Palladio, and the letters of Rowe, etc. So he's a huge collector. However, there is a distinction between collection and archive for him. Not all collections that architects compile are archival. Archiving requires an extra effort to organize, catalog, take inventory, code, preserve, and maintain a collection. While collections inspire design, the archive is a product of it. and is embedded in the design present. In recent years, in particular, we witness a seismic shift. I use a term from Barry Bergdahl here, when we saw contemporary architects getting more and more interested in receiving valuations of their work. Some of them even set up their own foundations to prepare for their own legacies in advance. We are familiar of a number of foundations that emerged in the last 10 years, I would say, following the example of well-established foundations around the legacy of Le Corbusier. The Le Corbusier Foundation, which you see on this slide, for instance, serving as a model to other architects to set up their own foundations. For instance, Norman Foster's foundation in Madrid was established in 2015. Renzo Piano's foundation was in Italy, in Genova, was established in 2008. Herzog and de Meuron's cabinet in Basel, and even Zaha Hadid began her own foundation in 2013 prior to her death. Each of these foundations hold archives and libraries of the respective architects with the aim of exhibiting and promoting the legacy of their work into posteriority. All these developments point to the need to question the role of archives in contemporary architecture. My ambition here is to shift the scholarly attention from incidental accounts of archives as sources to archives as practice, from archives to archiving. The aim is to explore the specific mechanisms of archival production today and to understand how archiving matters for practicing architects, how archiving connects to designing. As archives are embedded in the design present, I ask, what constitutes an architectural archive today? To what extent does design work depend on the intimacy with the archive now? What kind of tools, technologies, and crafts are needed in archiving? Or in other words, what kind of craft is archiving? As an anthropologist, I focus on the present, and I advocate a type of architectural anthropology that pays close attention to the production of architectural knowledge in its mundane and practical materiality. I treat archives not as sites of architectural, of knowledge retrieval, but as sites of knowledge production. I rely on an actor network theory approach, following both human participants in this process and non-human participants, such as archival objects, solvents, instruments, protocols, and scripts generated in archiving. I conducted a number of interviews and 2-year-long ethnographic observation of the practices of archivists, catalogers, conservators, architects, and curators to be able to trace the everyday rhythm of archiving as a way to access the specificity of the current conditions of architecture making. So archiving is always, for me, a vehicle to get access to architecture making, to designing. In 2014, I began a study of the Canadian Centre of Architecture in Montreal. This is an institution known to every architectural scholar and every architect in the world, a leading archival institution, but also an institution that is crucial as it generates architectural discourse. It's always on the forefront of architectural discourse, generating agenda, setting new topics for discussion for architects and architectural scholars. But it is not the visible CCA that I wanted to understand and describe with its well-established exhibition program, publications, the study center, all very known activities for the architectural scholar. But I wanted to see the invisible sides of archiving, the invisible sites where archival objects hide in a way in this institution, the vaults where the objects are first stored, the shipping area, the register, the conservation lab where we see huge models like this model of Cedric Price being restored, and the cataloging offices where the objects are being coded and cataloged, the workshops where the objects are being prepared for exhibits, the offices of the curators and many other participants in this process, and their collective discussions around a table, or very often full of archival objects, begging for attention and care. So I wanted to describe this hidden life of architectural objects and to understand the various different trajectories of the objects, and to account for all participants in this process of archiving. In this lecture, I will focus on selected episodes, or in particular 6 selected episodes from the secret life of architectural objects. And I will sketch briefly 6 ethnographic scenes from the daily work of archivists and conservators in architecture. We'll talk about registering an object in the shipping area, cataloging, conserving an object, opening an archival box, performing a treatment in a conservation lab, processing and rehousing objects, and treating born digital materials. So every move of archiving is captured in its situated context of practice and connected to a specific archival way of knowing. Episode 1. That's the first stage of the archival life of objects, registering the objects. First, we enter the shipping area, and that is where the material is usually received in the CCA. And as such, it is often the first place that the architecture objects visit upon their arrival at the CCA. Here, we can meet Alexandre and Marie, 2 technicians with different expertise and different roles in the process. They deal with the incoming objects. This could be objects on loan or objects received by donation. They open the boxes. They're very often the first to open the boxes indeed, and make the very first inspection of the objects and record the condition of the objects. So Alexandre prepares them for exhibits and for archival accessioning. Marie deals with all the requests of different objects. Once the case is opened, Alexandre takes pictures that capture the box when it is full of objects first, then pictures of the landing numbers follow, as well as individual pictures of all the objects inside the case. These pictures are part of Alexandre's own working archive. They suspend aesthetic judgment, and they simply serve the purpose of identification and internal documentary tracing. They record the state in which the objects have arrived, their package, and how they were exactly arranged. The act of photographing has an epistemic dimension here. It's not just a simple technical act of photographing the objects. It has an important epistemic dimension. This is Alexandre's way of understanding the object, his way of getting to know them better and recording this knowledge in the system. Then he gives them numbers, and numbering the objects is a way of demarcating their belonging to a certain documentary order or a specific material arrangement that has its own epistemic value as well. The code allows also objects to be traced, and that is how they make their beginning as archival at the CCA with that particular code that Alexander has given them, and they're in the system coded. Another important reason why objects pass through the shipping space is that in the case of contamination, the source has to be identified quickly and measures have to be taken accordingly so that the affected object do not infect other objects. When opening the case, Alexander is looking for signs by detecting a smell. So he's trying to smell the object to be able to detect problems. Smell is an important tracer here that allows us to follow objects from side to side and through various journeys. Follow Alexander for a moment and you'll witness how archival objects multiply. Far from being autonomous and composed, they're rather fragile and highly dependent since the moment they get registered, as they rely on the support system of scripts and devices, protocols and computer files that gather their traces and enable them to be traced. Episode 2. If a problem has been detected in the register, the object goes to the conservation lab. Here we witness archival objects battling uncertainty, the erosion of time, begging for care and negotiating with the environment. These are objects in a state of degradation or in a process of fading or aging. So only the problematic objects go there. Here in the conservation lab, the discussions revolve around solvents, smells, insects, or the possibility of infestation of drawings and other objects. On this side of archiving, we see chemicals, products, controlled temperatures, and different instruments, from the simple pipettes, scalpels, spatulas, knives, and sponges that you see on the table here on this slide, to huge and sophisticated microscopes that you see here. Conservator David is manipulating the microscope, using it to inspect carefully objects. It's here that architecture objects are very carefully inspected and described, and a condition report is prepared. This is the stage of diagnosis, we might say, and there is an abundant medical language here used in this laboratory. Conservators often use terminology like health check. The object health is being checked in the conservation lab. Terms like diagnosis, treatment, test, and microscopes and other terms and equipment that refer to this quasi-medical environment that we witness in the conservation lab. So this stage of diagnosis, David is inspecting an object, scrutinizing the symptoms and detecting possible flows of the archival object. A simple drawing or sketch, when examined in the lab, suddenly multiplies. A closer look at the report that you see on the left-hand side, this is the condition report. After the inspection of the object, this condition report is being prepared, and a closer look at this report shows that an object can be decomposed into 40 different features. Here we witness this multiplication. From 1, it becomes 40. And these features could be tears, scratches, folds, dirt, decoloration, cracks, insect damages, or stains, or the other different imperfections. After this careful report is produced, Karen, who you see here, could perform a treatment of the architectural object if needed. The treatment could be oxidation, de-infestation, neutralization of smell, restoration, or cleaning. Look at the bodily posture of Karen or David, all these conservators working in the lab, always leaning towards the objects, engaging in a highly mediated, slow, and meticulous process of caretaking. All these procedures go in tandem with the specific techniques of documenting and inscribing the traces of interventions and lead to the production of more working scripts, reports, and notes. They all aim at stabilizing the objects, making them much more resilient and less dependent on the environment, allowing them to sustain their architectural quality. After the lab, archival objects are fully prepared to embrace a new life, to go into an exhibition or to be viewed by different publics, or to go to the votes to be consulted and viewed by the researchers. For all these lives, the objects need a code. So the cataloging will begin. And this is the third episode from the life of the objects. To understand cataloging and coding, we meet Mary Gordon in her office on her computer. A tape measure is also placed on her desk, a curious object, we might say, among many other ordinary office objects, which you might notice on her desk. Mary develops the inventory and the classification scheme. The classification scheme is a hierarchy that goes from the font, the archive, to the series, then the sub-series, then the dossiers, down to the level of the files, which are the lowest. The files is the lowest level of the hierarchy. And it rarely goes down to just one single object. In the file, we find usually a group of objects. This could be 24 photographs, 5 drawings, 10 slides, etc. The content of the archive shapes the classification scheme. Yet the scheme is never fully fixed. As the catalogers work through the material, they discover things that might shift the content slightly and in an expected direction, and they might cause them to modify the classification scheme. Watch Mary working. While inspecting a drawing, she discovers new information written on the drawing itself, on the title block. Or she goes in the votes to measure a model, which explains the measure tape, which we have seen, and it's still on this slide. She needs the tape measure to be able to measure exactly the dimensions of the model. And all this information goes into her notes, then is added at the level of the file, in the computer system, in the inventory. She also discovers a new project and it updates the number of projects in the computer system. Cataloging, as we see it here, is not simply about adding codes to objects, identifying physical objects for the sake of an accurate description and truthful record keeping, but it also implies extracting knowledge. And this could be simple knowledge about dimensions, media, materiality, and size, as we have seen. The cataloger dives into the world that the object has opened up, extracts knowledge and adds it to the system, thus refining even further the classification scheme. The scheme will suggest an epistemological framework that will gradually serve the architectural shaping of scholarship and will be a precondition of architectural history. episode 4. If cataloging, as we have just seen, is an object-based activity, processing an archive is a different one. It is the act of describing and conceptually ordering the archival material. This is a process that often starts in the architectural practice when the practice is still active. Here, for instance, you see architect Alvaro Siza, still very active and working in his practice. And for instance, Siza began organizing his archive long time ago, long time before the archive has reached the CCA and other archival institutions. This happened more precisely back in the 90s when mountains of paper, as Siza calls them, from successful projects piled up in the practice, and the need for archiving became pressing. The archivist Cara Porchu, who you see sitting next to Siza, introduced an original order in the archive that closely reflects her knowledge of the firm. 30 years of experience, 30 years of closely working with the practice, first as an architect and then as an archivist. With the years, Cara gradually developed knowledge of where the things stood in an archive, on that shelf or in that drawer. Archiving is not about knowing all about Siza and his practice, his oeuvre, but it's about knowing a little, but knowing it well. Knowing also where to find more when needed. Because of the constant dialogue with the practice, with the time, Cara has cultivated a very special skill to recognize the small difference in the drawings, but also in the handwriting of Siza and his collaborators. So she can distinguish tiny differences, tiny variations between the style of drawing from the 60s compared to the 70s, and the same with the handwriting. These signs reveal the hidden collaborative dynamics in the practice as well. The craft of the archivist, as we witness here, is grounded in a very special type of apprenticeship to the signs of the drawings. As Cara worked on organizing the archive started training her to think through the signs and to interpret, to translate them for others. Going through sometimes thousands of copies and documents, Cara, assisted by another archivist, Magda, rarely throw things away. They keep all those versions of annotated drawings as they reveal the evolution of the drawing and the design thinking in the practice. The task of the archivists is not to make selections or evaluate what is the correct or the original version, but to keep all those versions to be able to guide people through all these copies. They do not engage in comparing iconic images with replicas, but rather maintain all these differences as having their own merit. The archive does not outline, as we see, the precious first or last idea, the single creator, or the original. Instead, what is foregrounded here is the multiplicity, the variations, the different ideas, the many different voices. Working with series of copies, detecting these tiny imperceptible differences and signs, tracing new connections, the archivists perform a skeletal epistemological structuring of the works of a firm, in this case, Siza's firm, that will eventually become imprinted in the classification scheme of the archive at the CCA. Once in Montreal, the work of archiving continues. The boxes arrive and the CCA archivists engage in rehousing the material, placing it in acid-free folders and establishing new connections through physical displacement. Here we see Adria, the archivist, working on the other side of the Atlantic in Montreal, and just like Chiara, Adria is able to extract new knowledge and engage in additional reading of science. Archiving generates a configuration of new relations, as we see here, where knowing becomes possible. Episode 5. At the CCA, we learn there are two types of archives. The well-organized archive, which we have just seen in the office of CISA, and the messy archive, as Mirko Zardini, the director of the CCA at the time, calls this second type of archive. If the well-organized archive keeps the fingerprints of an archivist, like Chiara, who has spent years and years reading the signs of the design process and translating them into an archival order, the messy archive keeps the traces of design process as they were left by the practice. Follow Giovanna, the curator, the chief curator of the CCA at the time and now director of the CCA. Follow her as she opens a box from the Cedric Price's archive, a messy archive indeed. We find a folder with the Macapie report, the red folder that you see. Then we look at another folder with the Price's aviary project in London from 1963. We look at the plan for the park and the structures for animals. We inspect all the books he collected for the project. And we find many other documents like trade catalogs about animals, some letters, a range of other documents like images, brochures, quotes, magazines, press clippings, and others. What an amazing range of things come out of this simple box. For Giovanna, and here I quote, "Archives are brilliant because they are so many funny things," say Giovanna, especially with Cedric Price's archive. It's really a delight to go through the boxes. You always find strange, surprising things. End of quote. The archive contains, as we see, heterogeneous materials that we try to decipher as signs, as hieroglyphs, just like Chiara was doing this on the works of Caesar. And we, with Giovanna, we start thinking through these signs and we start interpreting them. These materials very often blend social, design, and technical features. The archive contains an amazing bundle of things that reflect the composite, collective nature of a design process and the entangled relationship of design with society. It is important to comprehend the positioning of a document within this relational aggregate that the archive is, and also to understand why it repeats itself in so many variations. Look at these different copies. None of these different copies that we find in an archive are random. And when we find 10, 15, 30 copies or variations of the same document, we wonder, what challenges were at stake in the practice? Why did they have to make so many copies? What did they struggle with? All these copies, in a way, point to a moment of difficulty, a significant battle in the practice that led them to do many attempts, many trials. The repetitions, the material accumulations reveal the dynamic intensity of the design process. And flipping through the repetitive versions, We also perform a reading of all signs on the surface that entirely dilutes the dichotomy of original and copy. The archive maintains the particular order of things generated in practice, keeping the imprints from Price's and his collaborators' hands, the hidden patterns of the office routines. It is not a random assortment of things, but a body of work defined by design-driven connectivity, forces, and tensions. A relational entity, we might say, assembled to host, juxtapose, and preserve the traces of designing. The architectural archive subsists as a dynamic aggregate, celebrating repetitions, tolerating irregularities, reproducing manyness, and generating wonders. Episode 6, digital archiving, and this is our final episode. Shadowing digital archivists at work, we witness that the archiving of the digital implies a radically different set of practices than paper archiving, which we have just witnessed. The digital archival object is elusive, always moving fast and moving quickly forward in time, ahead of time, multiplying and encompassing a vast number of aspects. Digital archiving implies knowledge about the technological future, software environments and technological change, copyright licenses, file formats, emulated environments, digital preservation copies, storage. Digital archivists think creatively about the life cycle of the archival object and how to make it relevant in 20 years. How do we open a file in 20 years? How can we battle technological obsolescence? How to preserve a digital system so that it can still be read in 20 years? So these are the concerns of the digital archivist. Moreover, digital architecture-specific media make the task of archiving the digital very demanding. The CAT and the BIM files with drawings are unique to architecture and present distinct architectural challenges, very different than the challenges of paper archiving. Digital archivists are also in active dialogue, not just with designers as creators of archives, but also with many other specialists, with computer experts, with IT and copyright specialists, software companies, with digital heritage institutions and affiliated industries. Here we deal with a much wider network of collaborators and institutions relevant to the profession of digital preservation. So with this episode, I have completed my 6 sketches of the hidden life of architectural objects, trying to unravel the multiple epistemic dimensions of archiving through these 6 episodes. And as we see in these different scenes of archiving, tracing different moves of archiving, we begin to question some established myths of creativity and authorship in architecture. They all spectacularly collapse in archiving. To conclude the lecture, we see that architectural archive is not just the reflection of the mind of an architect. It is, as we have witnessed through these different scenes of archiving, it is a much more complex additive entity that takes inspiration from design as a collective, heterogeneous and social process. It's drawings, letters, quotes, all these materials that we have seen in Cedric Price's archive, plus technologies, plus skills, plus many different collaborative dynamics and expertise, plus the social and cultural issues entangled with architecture. The archive is context and content at the same time. Far from idealizing the archive with capital A as an ultimate source of architectural knowledge or a supreme technology of architectural history with capital H, what I advocate here is the need to study archiving as a process, and all participants in archiving, while Caesar's name or Eisenman's name or Koolhaas's name or Cedric Price's name will be engraved in the golden books of architectural history, no one, and they are already engraved, no one has ever heard of Cara, Adria, Pamela, Karen, David, Anne, and I can continue the list of actors that I have mentioned here. All these people who spend years and years and years archiving, processing, and taking care of these objects. Tracing the moves of archiving allows us to witness the usually invisible work of all these actors who generally remain silent and outside the limelight of mainstream architectural historiography. Moreover, archiving is never about a specific object, but always about architectural material of larger social and epistemic importance for the discipline. The situated practices of sign reading, arranging, cataloging, caretaking, and preserving generate larger structuring effects in an archive, effects that resonate with greater epistemological anxieties in the discipline and the profession. Archiving emphasizes the active and reciprocal nature of architectural knowledge. It is a way of extracting, correcting, and interpreting knowledge that will form the epistemological basis of architectural scholarship. It is a way of crafting history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albena. I would like to encourage people who have questions to write them in the chat box, so that we can read them and address them orderly in a little while. But while people get ready and the engines start to produce the questions, maybe I can start by just bringing up some of the issues that I think are interesting, of the many issues that I think are interesting in your lecture and your book. Maybe as a way to bring together different parts of your lecture, you seem to be telling us that that the archive is this instrument or this device that is inserted in the middle between architectural practice and architectural history, and that one could look at the archive in relationship with both practice and history as a kind of mediation between the two, and look at the relationships and the blending of these different domains, let's say, of practice. I mean, understanding that architectural practice and archival practice and historical practice are also, all of them are specific kinds of practice and practices, and that the study of the archive opens up, this kind of bidirectional relationships between both. And I think perhaps, yeah, that's I think an interesting framework. And I think, you know, you are suggesting that that there is an increasing blending of these different spheres or practices, right? And perhaps there are points at which these different practices cannot be distinguished entirely from each other, right? Which I think is also a very interesting proposition, where things begin to sort of bleed into each other, no? Into different domains begin to bleed into each other. So going from there, I think perhaps I would, you know, I would start by perhaps asking you if do you see a specific, you know, type of relationship in these practices that's different from, say, the practices of art archival, you know, or how in the realm of art, you know, these relationships play out differently, and how architecture perhaps has a specific, you know, dynamic in that relationship. So perhaps we could begin with that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, a very interesting point as well. With art archives, of course, we have very often a single authorship, much more present than in architectural practices, although this myth has been deconstructed as well in art history, because we're all familiar with the work of Alpers on Rembrandt, where she shows magnificently that even Rembrandt's paintings were not personally made by Rembrandt, but there was a crowd of collaborators who were working under his guidance in the workshop of Rembrandt. So even in art history, some of those myths of the single authorship have been deconstructed. And I can continue with these examples, but still in architecture, the collective nature of architectural practice is much more present, much more I would say is much more of a contemporary reality than in artistic practices. And this is, of course, a long discussion of comparison with a lot of nuances. That's one possible line, of course, of comparison. And then the other line of comparison could be around what makes art and what makes architecture the medium. And especially in architecture, what we have is scale, for instance, or these proportions and scales that very often depend on the material support. We know very, very well that a drawing drawn on tracing paper, because of the fragile materiality of tracing paper that can shrink, and depending on humidity, the shrinking can be catastrophic for conveying key features of the architectural quality of this drawing, and in particular scale. So here we see that the medium and the material support of the architectural thinking and also the architectural final products vary incredibly. And of course, again, this is a very long line of comparison as well, and scale is just one of those criteria, and we can add many different criteria as well, where the comparisons could be sustained. That's a discussion on its own, and it's very interesting aspect. So thank you, Julian.
Sorry, I was muted. I was saying, I was saying that we have a number of questions that are showing up here, and I think I'd like to relay them to you because I think they are great, and maybe we can continue from there. So, some of our students and also faculty are asking you. For example, Marina Rodriguez is asking you, "Thank you very much, Albena, for your presentation. I was wondering, what do you think could be the misuses of the archive? Do you think there is such thing as an abuse of the archive?"
Yeah, that's a very interesting point indeed. I haven't thought about this though. as there are different possible users of the archive as well. And depending on the possible users, we could have different types of misuse. I deliberately, in this story, in this book, I deliberately do not include all possible users, because we could equally add episodes of the hidden life of objects where we can see architectural scholars visiting the archive and trying to read those signs of archiving, or architectural practitioners visiting the archives and trying to find specific drawings because they are planning a renovation or a restoration of a building, and therefore their particular use of the archive will be a very different one than the use of the scholars. And we can continue the list of artists, for instance, artists visiting the archive with the idea to select very specific drawing or images that they will take out, replicate, or ask for copies and include in an exhibit. And we can continue the list of professors, people interested in innovating architectural pedagogy and looking for a very particular image or very particular object that has never been included in publication, so they will go to the original archive. All these possible uses will of course lead to misuses, and of course there are many nuances of the misuse.
But maybe
yeah.
Sorry, I just wanted to maybe follow up on Marina's question. I know Marina, and I'm sort of intuiting what's behind this question. Maybe I can sort of try to unpack it a little bit. I'm wondering if there isn't a kind of presumption that, you know, the work on the archive, there's always something a little perverse about working with the archive. The idea that you are trying to find something that the author of the work didn't want you to know in the first place, right? So that you are opening up something that wasn't necessarily up for kind of a direct reception, and so my question is perhaps this idea that there is always a kind of implied that the use of the archive is always implicitly a misuse, right? Perhaps.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect indeed. Yeah, well, maybe even in the messy archive, with all its messiness, because it's never as meticulously organized as the organized archive we have seen with Caesar's example, organized for 30 years. So it's a lot of effort and a lot of work mobilized there. But even in the messy archive, at the start, when it enters the CCA, there is an attempt to put some order in the disorder, and there's a careful selection of documents that are not relevant to architectural scholarship. So, for instance, all the Christmas cards, love letters, all the personal information that they could find in a box with architectural objects and drawings will be eliminated, will be taken out of the box, and then they will be returned to the family donating the archive. So there is some kind of selection so that that makes impossible the complete misuse, if I have to put it in this way. And then, of course, because this archive is never fully organized and fully sanitized, it's always a box full of surprises. It can always surprise the researcher and the architect looking at this material and trying to find things, and there's always a surprise that comes out of this relational entity that the archive is. So again, I wouldn't say this is a misuse, but there is a layer of order after a layer of order added to this disorder that makes impossible the full misuse of the archive, I would say.
Thank you. I'm going to read another question that we have here. Lorena Quintana says, apparently during his tenure running the New York Metropolitan Museum, Philip de Montebello acquired over 80,000 objects, the overwhelming majority of which were packed away in boxes and sent to storage in New Jersey, never to be seen again. How does the idea of growing archives reconcile with the limited resources of archival institutions? When does an aesthetic or other kind of evaluation necessary for the allocation of limited resources get involved?
Yeah, well, that's an excellent question indeed. Most of the archives have exactly the fate of Philippe de Montebello's archive and the story that Lorena has just described. So most of the archives never opened, not just because of storage. Storage is one side of it. Architectural interest is the other.
Mm.
So sometimes we follow these hypes of different interests, like for instance, now we're all interested in post-war architecture, we're all interested in the 60s and the 70s, but this moment will pass. And very often this interest is related to the acquisition of a specific archive. So acquisition of archive or availability of the archive is closely connected to the interest in it. And the other way around. Storage is indeed very precious. Architectural institutions are very selective because storage is very difficult to find. It costs a lot of money, and that's why they're very careful of what kind of archives they acquire. They used to buy archives in the 60s. They don't buy archives any longer. Architects have to consider themselves very lucky, like architects like Caesar, that an institution like the CCA will be willing to take care of their archives, as this is an enormous institutional effort. As we have seen, all this work of care, of storage, of cataloging, so it involves a lot of work and a lot of course, it's related to a lot of financial and institutional resources as well, plus the danger of storage as well, because if these boxes are left in the cellar of an architectural practice or in the attic, of course, we don't know what will happen with them in 10 or 20 years, because they will be submitted to the dangers of time, humidity, fire, anything could happen with these archives. Of course, if they are stored safely in an institution, in the vaults of an institution, this, of course, ensures their future, provided architecture scholars are interested in opening those boxes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to read another question. Ami Rigotti asks, isn't it a bit naive to attribute neutrality to archiving and assimilating data with the construction of history?
Mm-hmm. I wouldn't say there is neutrality in archiving, yeah. From the very start of, and famous examples we're familiar with in the construction of architectural history, we know that the construction of a particular type of scholarship depends on the abundance of the archive. And the example we all have in mind is developed by Beatrice Colomina with her comparison between Le Corbusier and Adolphe Loos's archive. Le Corbusier was an obsessive archivist, we all know it. He even gave instructions to his parents of how to write letters to him, because these letters will go into history. So he was so much conscious of his own legacy, and this abundant, excessive archive resulted in an abundant number of books written on Le Corbusier, and Adolphe Loos destroyed his archive, which explains smaller numbers of books published on his work. So that's on the one hand, we have this distinction between abundant and scarce archive, but what happens in the archive is never neutral and never innocent, as I attempted to illustrate with this small moves of archiving, and at different levels in the process. There's constant modification, correction of knowledge. Sometimes it's very little because we are not talking about propositional knowledge, factual knowledge about architecture. We are talking about knowledge of how to do things. For instance, in the conservation lab, conservators very often deal with very specific knowledge that they gain by simply looking at the back of the objects. One of the conservators was telling me, I know these objects by the back. I can recognize an Eisenman, I can recognize a Caesar drawing by the back, because she has worked on this object, looking at the surface, at the granularity of paper, at the corners, at the hinges. So it's a very specific molecular, granular knowledge of the object that she has acquired. So it's knowledge how. The digital archivists have this knowledge forward, because they're trying to predict what happens in 20 years from now. Chiara has this knowledge where to find things. So all this variations of knowledge, little variations of knowledge, they gradually lead towards correcting interpretations and correcting the knowledge accumulated about an architect, about a movement, the propositional knowledge, the knowledge about architecture. And therefore, all these small little choices, small little moves contribute to a very particular, to possible constructions. I wouldn't say to one very particular deliberate construction of architectural history, but to possible constructions of historical interpretations and narratives.
Thank you, Albena. We have a few more questions, and we are typically very much inclined to asking questions in lectures, so bear with us. Sol Ghanim says, thanks, Yaneva, for the lecture. I was wondering, what do you think about archives that are sold to institutions abroad and stop being available for people living in the same place? An artist or an architect worked and lived. Is that a way of expanding the work and thinking of the artists, thinking of those artists, or is that another way of leaving people from poorest countries without their own history, colonial paradigm, or maybe both? Thanks.
Yeah, well, that's a very important question indeed. And I have seen it also with the case of Caesar's archive, because there was a big polemic, a big controversy when Álvaro César decided to donate the archive to the CCA. He was literally called traitor in the national newspapers. There was a big debate, but at the same time, there was not an institution with the same expertise and the same institutional infrastructure like the CCA in Portugal. Caesar, I interviewed him on that aspect in particular, because I was interested in why the archive is going to the CCA and what were the other options. He said in an interview that he was looking for other institutions, but he couldn't find an institution that could take care of the drawings. And he really felt the need to share those drawings and his works with students, with professors, teaching his work in architectural schools. After this polemic, the CCA started negotiating with two other institutions in Portugal, the Serralves Foundation and the Gulbenkian. And they found a solution to distribute the archive between the three institutions. So projects relevant to Porto and Lisbon stayed in the Porto and the Lisbon institution, and then a project with more international relevance went to the CCA, and they found a compromise which is very good, because it also connects the three institutions in a network. It makes them collaborate. When they organize an exhibit now, they have to work together. They synchronize their systems as well, the cataloging system. So if you want to find as a researcher a document, you can more easily search through the systems of the three institutions. So this simple distribution of the archive among three institutions led to collaborations and also to a much bigger organized effort to produce an architectural discourse, which also nurtured the discourse in Portugal. And overall, it was a useful exercise, a useful attempt, useful initiative, although extremely problematic and polemic at the start.
So maybe in relationship with that, I can maybe ask you something. I don't know if your research at the CCA has shed any light on this issue, but I do know that because of just browsing the CCA website some time ago, that some of the material is actually available in digital format, that they have actually digitized some of the material, and then, you know, basically anybody can see it. So perhaps I'd like to add to that question, if the CCA or if, do you think that there might be some general trend toward making these materials available online? I don't know if this is politically an issue that can actually happen, but I think the consequences of such action would be, I mean, absolutely, world-changing almost, because all of a sudden this material is not, I mean, you cannot touch it, but as you say in the book, you can't touch it anyway. So, it would be a big deal actually if this if for some reason there would be the funding and the political decision to make this material widely available. Is that something that you see happening, or is that something that just to get a taste of the archives?
Yeah, at the moment when I was working the CCA, when I was doing my ethnographic observation, there was a huge institutional effort to engage in updating the system, updating the website, and actively digitizing as well material which is not digitally born. This was a massive institutional initiative. I don't know to what extent the plan is to open widely the archive. And you're asking me to kind of take a stance, almost like a political stance, in the institutional politics of the CCA, which I cannot really do, but I think it will be a good idea, as you say, to be able to do this digital consulting from the researcher's perspective. Although the contact with the actual object will be missed, and that's why in exhibits or in the consultation in votes, this very kind of sometimes enigmatic presence of the object could also be epistemically interesting if, of course, it's possible to consult the object in space in the votes. In other words, digitization and digital archiving would not be the solution. Would not be a solution for all these issues and problems that we have as researchers, as scholars, when we want to fully understand an archive. I would say we will somehow miss the magic of witnessing the disorder, all this kind of wondrous objects that come out of a box, archival box, and this surprises and what Margarita called misuse of the archive. This misuse would probably, well, in an electronic consultation, it will be much more guided towards a very specific use, or as Ami was saying, towards a very specific construction of a narrative. Whereas if you consult the archive yourself, you could be much more free in terms of choosing possible objects and therefore possible interpretations, and you could generate possible misuses of the archive as well, which cannot happen in the digital space, I would say.
Okay, so we are approaching the end of our allotted time. I've seen two more questions here, but I think one of them you basically answered Ignacio's question, because it was somehow the question that I also asked, and I think that you've addressed that. And there's a question by Emiliano saying, archiving has been described as a posteriori process. I wonder how architectural practice and thinking will be affected by increasing archivist knowledge, and if that could cause the loss of some of the amorphous accumulation of material common to architectural practice, affecting in turn future archives. maybe you want to address that last question a little bit?
Right. How architectural practice and thing will be affected by the archivist knowledge is indeed a very interesting twist in the story. It's not just the practice affecting the production of the archive, but also the archive affecting the practice. There's this constant dialogue between practice and archive, which I have witnessed, especially in practices that are still active. The reason I mentioned only two architects here, interviews with two architects here, only Eisenman and Caesar. It's not a random choice of just two architects, but it's because the very first body of work of an international architect that the CCA acquired was the body of work of Eisenman. So it's the very first international archive they had. And then the most recent one I have seen, of course, there are others after 2015, but when I started my observation, they were about to acquire Alvaro Siza. So that's the beginning and the end as I captured it, but the story continues and the institution is very dynamic and working on many different fronts at the moment. So with working and visiting the practices of these two architects to understand how archive matters for their projects and for their design, I have indeed witnessed this constant dialogue between practice and archive. Architects always need the archive because the archive is not dead. It's not just a silent repository of things, of universal kind of knowledge about projects, but they constantly go and visit the archive to be able to reuse ideas, to be able to mobilize some previous projects and insights or previous technical solutions developed in another project, mobilize them for a current project. And the archive is this active technical memory of the practice. It's never just a storage, something put in the storage. And then the other way around, the archivist, to be able to produce an active and working archive, has to be always in the practice and has to maintain this active dialogue with the practice. And she should know how the practice functions, what are the current collaborations, the current tensions, the current challenges in the practice, and how to organize the archive according to this kind of order of things that are witnessed in the design practice, as the archive has to reflect the culture and the working culture and the spirit of the practice.
Well, that's a great, I think, final reflection. So, you know, I'd like to thank you very much for this lecture and for taking all of our questions, but also for your extended commitment to the program and to the students and all over this very strange year that we've not really gotten out of yet. But yes, it was, I think it was a very productive experience for all of us, and I hope that we will find good excuses to continue it in the near future.
Thank you. Thank you, Julian. Yeah, thank you for all the questions and for this collaboration, which was fantastic for me as well. Thank you.
Well, we'll see you very soon.
See you.